you touched upon something else that I'm going to ask you a question that I was going to ask you earlier. Like you mentioned, you touched upon funding the trust. Like, what does that mean? And I've heard that term thrown around, and clients sometimes just think living. Maybe it's a two-part. It is a two-part question.
Okay.
One is that, hey, I've done a living trust, but you just mentioned funding the trust. What does that mean? And secondly, like you just mentioned about the property, let's assume I bought a property, but it's not part of the trust. Is it still covered? And
Okay.
so let's take it one at a time.
That's good. Those are great questions. And I'm very glad you asked them. So I like to consider, along with being a wagon, a trust is a box. And if the box is empty, it doesn't really do any good. So a trust is essentially an agreement, a contract, okay? Once that contract, that trust is signed, it then becomes an entity that assets can be transferred into, okay? So for most people, their most valuable asset is their home. And so typically I have clients come to me, a married couple that will own as joint tenants. I usually, first of all, transfer it to community property with right of survivorship for tax benefit reasons, but we can talk about that or not. But the most important thing is that it then also gets put into the trust. And that means funding the trust. So funding the trust means literally getting the assets that aren't currently inside the trust into the trust. So for example, if you own it as joint tenants, then in the trust, you would own it as trustees of the trust. So for real property, you actually have to prepare and record a new deed, or two deeds with what I was just talking about, where you literally transfer the home into the trust. So the trust, whoever is acting as the trustee, technically holds the assets for the benefit of the beneficiaries. So while you're living, you are trustee of the trust that you create. But if something happens to you, the person that you name as successor trustee can manage that property for the benefit of the beneficiaries. So bank accounts, same thing. If you own something, if you have a bank account that's in your name, you're going to retitle that account as trustee of your trust. And so funding the trust involves two things. One, putting certain assets in the trust, and also making the trust the designated beneficiary of assets that don't go in the trust, specifically life insurance and retirement accounts.
What do you mean? So a life insurance review, just break it down a little bit further, because I'm curious. That's interesting.
So life insurance and retirement accounts are passed by beneficiary designation, which means if you if you open up a life insurance policy or have retirement accounts, the institutions have you name a beneficiary who receives those funds upon your death, okay? So what we do is, and I typically recommend for married couples, that they actually have the trust be the designated beneficiary for the life insurance. Because if something happened to one or both of them, it would automatically flow into the trust and be used according to the terms of the trust. For retirement accounts, there are tax benefits for spouses and other individuals to be named the primary beneficiaries. But in a married situation, I always have the trust be the contingent beneficiary, because if both parents pass away, then the trust could be the beneficiary of the retirement accounts.
That makes perfect sense.
And if there's a single parent, in both cases, the trust would be the benefit. With minor children, the trust would be basically the vessel that receives all the assets that are then distributed according to their wishes. I hope that's helpful. I know
definitely. I think this is exactly the kind of things that I think our viewers need to know, because and we'll break this down. And I think you did a wonderful job explaining why funding the trust is important, because I had a situation where I had clients that were very comfortable, like, we already have a trust. And I'm like, well, then I noticed I happened to see the deed, and I'm like, well, I don't see the trust named. And from what I knew, I was like, okay, this has to be specifically changed. It can't just be, they had no idea that they thought they had done everything, whereas they'd only done half the work.
So that actually, let me actually answer your other question a little bit more. So that's another thing, is part of the process that I go through all my clients, that I do make sure that they get their trust funded with their assets. I take care of preparing and recording the deeds for real property. And either they will take care of funding the assets with my unlimited guidance and direction, or I can do it for an additional fee. But I usually like to support clients in doing it themselves so they have more ownership over it. Um, but here's the thing, and why it's so important to continue reviewing those trusts on at least every 3 years, is because people might buy another piece, even if the primary residence is in the trust. And a little side note, a lot of times lenders will take, if they're refinancing, will take a home out of the trust to do the refinance and might forget to put it back in. So I've heard of that happening. And then also people might acquire a second home or an income property. And, when they're going through that whole process, they might just not remember to put it in the trust, or they might open accounts or receive inheritances or all these things. And so, you might have done all the right things when you set out to create your trust, but then things happen in time. And so it's really important to kind of babysit the assets in the trust and make sure that everything is where it should be, so that you don't have a plan that doesn't work.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that you do that, because that's my nightmare scenario where, uh,